all of you, but in particular, our esteemed panelists, Professor Nelson Maldonado Torres, all the way from the US and from the Caribbean. He's already joined us. He's been with us for the last 5 minutes. Let me also start by apologizing for
Adam.
Our sister, Comrade Nomagugu. Oh, she's on. All right, you are there, Comrade Nomagugu. Please switch on your microphone.
Hello, greetings, Comrade.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I thought you're still.
I'm still on the way.
You are still on the way. Okay, okay.
Yes, I wanted to make sure that I can still listen. Yes.
Yes, no. I'm glad that you managed to log on whilst you're still on the way. Professor Maldonado Torres is already here, your fellow panelist. We are just waiting on Comrade Mandla Seleoane. He was engaged in another webinar about 30 minutes to an hour ago. So he just pre-warned me that he might be slightly late, but he promised to join and to share with us. But that's not going to delay and maybe diminish our program, because we have you and Professor Maldonado Torres. So thank you very much. And welcome to all the other participants who have joined in. I see this is probably very popular because we have 14 participants already. Today's topic, or today's focal area, is on Black ideology and practice. So we'll be doing a review, if you like, a retrospective of how Black ideology has developed over the years, or what we call Black ideology. And we have the panelists to define and explain this topic for us, and they will share their ideas as people who are engaged with ideological issues, either as part of their occupation or as activists or as writers. So Professor Maldonado Torres here is a lecturer in philosophy, and he has also published books on decoloniality, and he has obviously delved with this subject much more deeply. And yourself, Comrade Nomagugu, you are an activist with the Black House Collective in Soweto, where you are tasked or seized with the task of, forming young minds, orientating them to their old world, to their own Black outlook, as it were. So your perspective, as well as an activist and as somebody who is engaged with building ideologies on a day-to-day basis, is most valued and welcome. Let me not waste much time and hand over to Professor Nelson Maldonado Torres to give us the lay of the land, and then I will then let yourself and Ndade Mandla Seleoane to come in later. So thank you very much, Prof. This is we are celebrating Black History Month, as you are aware, and we thought we should approach you as somebody who, you are also engaged with South African issues. You've made several visits to our country, so you are quite familiar with the kind of topic that we'll be handling tonight. But over to you, and please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be here with you from the other side of the pond in the US.
I'm here.
Zoom lo baba.
Okay, please may we ask the participants to mute because we have the speaker on the podium now. And may I ask for all of us comrades who are not on the podium to go on mute so that we respect and give our presenter the opportunity to share what he has prepared for us. Thank you, Prof. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, I'm really very happy to participate in this activity and honored to be with you celebrating Black History Month. I consider Asania a second home, place I feel much more at home than in the US actually. And so this is a kind of you're giving me a gift by being able to connect with you in this way. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I would like to share. But I see that there is something else share in the...
Okay, I think it's Tau Mokoka. Ndade Mokoka. I see you are sharing something here and perhaps you are doing it the wrong way. This is just for presentations, not to share the broadcast. So please just... Ndade Mokoka Wangutwa. Hello?
Hello?
Ndade Mokoka. Oh, I was asking that you shouldn't use the share screen. We want to reserve it for Professor Maldonado Torres because he has a presentation. So if you are sharing, just stop sharing and then we'll be able to see what he has prepared for us. Please go ahead, Prof. He's fixed it now.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that.
This is okay. This is the world of Zoom.
Yes, yes, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, give me just a second. I'll set this up. And what you should see in a second is one slide that says
right, yes.
Academic Professor. Is that what you have?
Yeah, I can see that from my side. I'm sure the participants can also see it.
Okay, beautiful. So I'm going to be talking about Black ideologies and practice, but maybe more than Black ideologies, but also Black knowledge.
Okay.
And practice, right? First, I want to comment on, I usually, of course, because I teach at the university, and I have the rank of professor at the university, and I'm presented as a professor, and also as an academic. Okay, we have another microphone around there.
All right, just some of these problems will keep happening, but I will manage them from my end and mute them. So please just go ahead.
Perfect. Okay. Yes, it's only that if I lose the concentration for a second because of that, I'll just wait for me to mute and then I'll continue.
I know. Okay, now thank you.
Okay. So I was commenting on these labels of professor and academic, right? That people who work in the university, of course, often received, and just though after a while, I do not see myself. These are kind of hats that I wear at the university, but those are not my main hats or the hats that I will use to characterize myself, even in conversation like this. Right. But I appreciate though, and I completely understand. So I know, but I want to comment on that because it speaks about the issue of practice and knowledge production, Black knowledge production, right? Because if it is more liberal knowledge, institutional knowledge production, then academic and professor are proper names. So what are the kind of proper namings, concepts that kind of that are proper to the kind of practice, let's say a Black epistemic practice.
Okay.
And one such concept that I take it from the Afro-Ecuadorian elder who passed away a few years ago, Juan Garcia, he published this book with Catherine Walsh, who is one of the foremost leaders in the colonial thinking and the colonial pedagogy. They worked together for many years in multiple projects. They had a very beautiful relationship and very constructive relationship in Ecuador. And And Juan Garcia, our abuelo, elder, grandfather of the movement, Juan Garcia, he referred to himself as an obrero del proceso. This is someone who was, kind of scholar. He did oral interviews. He was an activist, and he referred to that labor as obrero del proceso, which means something like worker of the process.
Okay.
The worker of the process. So imagine what is to think of oneself as a worker of the process, not academic, not person, the worker of the process. And worker of the process has to do here for him and within the African, activist Black communities. It's about kind of conceiving the practice of thinking as one of also planting ideas, planting practices, planting epistemologies, sowing and planting and cultivating. Right? And so the title of this book is Pensar Sembrando. You see it there in the top, right? Pensar Sembrando, Sembrar Pensando, which means thinking while planting or sowing, and sowing while thinking. Okay. And so these are organic concepts about how Afro-Ecuadorian activists have seen their struggle for not only survival, but for transformation and decolonization of the spaces that they inhabit after they were kidnapped from different places in Africa, brought to the Americas, and put to live in plantations and in conditions that were extremely difficult. Many of them, of course, fleeing, escaping to the mountains, and they are organizing communities of resistance that happening in Ecuador. And the movement, Afro-Ecuadorian movement, benefit from all that kind of legacy of subversions, of communities of Afro-descendants in the region. Now, this Obrero del Proceso, right, is a word in Spanish. This book is in Spanish. And so if from Ecuador, I myself am from Puerto Rico, I am from the Caribbean. But many, not because Obrero del Proceso, but sometimes I know that in South Africa, the colonial thought is many people look at it as if coming from Latin America, right? This is kind of an importation from Latin America. And I have written in different places that it is not proper or correct to label it Latin American for multiple reasons. I will not go into it at this time, but I will say something about it. Because yesterday I was listening to a fascinating conversation by a group of 2 female Black activists in Puerto Rico, who organized this space which is called Afro Saberes, which means Afro knowledges. Afro knowledges. So that's another concept. We have Afro knowledges, Obrero del Proceso, worker of the process. And there they were talking with a number of artists. One of them was Awilda Sterling, who is a choreographer, artist. I mean, he's just an incredible Afro-Puerto Rican artist. And she was saying that when, Puerto Rico in the map, Puerto Rico is like here. It's a little island here. You see, it's not in the continent. It's right there. And you see, it received many of these nations. All these regions received these waves of people and who traveled, who were brought forcefully to these different places. So many of these islands here are majority Black territories. Are majority Black. So it's not only you find majority Black territories in continental Africa, you also find a number of places in the Caribbean islands that are, of course, majority Black. And so she was saying that when he was young, there used to be in Puerto Rico, there are communities and sectors that are identified as Afro-Puerto Rican. Of course, African culture, everything runs through the entire culture, the language, everything as well. And there is very strong contact with the other parts of the Caribbean. And for a long time, there is travel and communities travel. And Puerto Ricans used to travel quite a lot to other islands of the Caribbean. And she was one of them. She said she went to other islands, some of which are majority Black and some of which do not speak, the dominant language is not Spanish, it's English, or is French, or is Creole, right? It's a multiplicity of languages. So you see that multiplicity of language and the centrality of Blackness in that experience of the Caribbean makes it very different from the idea and project of Latin America, which tends to be mestizo, light skin mestizo, and that claims descendants from Europe. So you see, when she was commenting yesterday, that when she was in a class, and then it was like, I think she said like she was in college already or high school when someone said, well, Puerto Ricans are Latin Americans. And she was saying, no, she conceived the Caribbean as a nation and as her nation. And it's a Caribbean that is very connected, much more directly connected with Africa than with Europe or even with South America or Latin America. Right? That is the affiliation with Africa is very strong. And it plays, that's why an organization like Afro Saberes, this Afro-Puerto Rican organization, pays a lot of attention to Afro-Puerto Rican culture, but is heavily interested. And one of the organizers has done many conferences and organizations in different parts of Africa. So the idea that there is something out there in Latin America that is decolonial and then comes to the other continent, that notion that is from continent to continent, this doesn't go like that. I think the coloniality, you can explain it a lot by these flux of people who were forced from one place to the other, who were categorized and are categorized as a Black in different parts of the world, including, and two of these crucial parts are the Caribbean. And so I have always felt a closeness in that sense from, with Africa. It's not Africa, just like Africa is on the Caribbean, but they're much closer than we think. And we do not, there is it is disorienting to look at the colonial like something Latin American, because we contest that, because all of these reasons gives too much, concedes too much to like the skin mestizos in Europe. I already said that we are going to, I'm going to be talking about knowledge, not only ideology.
Very interesting.
But then I want to say that this, what I am describing about this closeness, how I see the colonial thinking in Africa, is also has translated itself in this collaboration between an institute that I currently direct, the Rutgers Advanced Institute for Critical Caribbean Studies, and the Black House Collective in Soweto. So we have worked together now for a number of years and collaborated in a number of projects. And it has to do about producing what we have called the Black House paradigm of knowledge production. So it's about knowledge, but it's also about practice, as you will see. And I'm going to go fast because I know that time is short and we have one more time for discussion.
Okay, yeah.
And I know that there are colleagues possibly in the call who are participating, and of course they're most welcome to correct me, add, exchange, all of this. This is just presenting a little bit of the work that we have done together. So this is the motto of the Black House Collective on ending the world as we know it, which echoes, of course, with the work of Fanon and Césaire, also about ending the world as we know it. Now, if you have been in the Black House, you may have likely found yourself in a context like this, right? Of intense thinking, reflecting, debating of Black people that are making it the Black House.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the collaborations that we have done, one of them is this summer school camp for youth. And you see that the main themes are Black consciousness and decoloniality. This was 2019, so not too long ago. And this is the basis of what we were trying to do, Black House Collective paradigm of decolonizing knowledge, power, and being, with our respective logos, narratives. And this is a picture of Rituli Orlein, who is one of the key thinkers and organizers of the Black House. And this is also while we were working on the schedule of the school, introducing Black consciousness and decoloniality to youth. This was also linked to reading groups in high schools that students were doing. The school camp was like the culmination of that. Okay. And there was another group called Bantu Thoughts. And Bantu Thoughts went to different high schools and middle schools around the Soweto area, doing these different, reading groups and debate sessions and preparing Black youth in the region to think and think carefully and rigorously and bravely. And so this is the picture of one of the schools. This is the material. We use the material of SASO, the SASO newsletters. That's the material that we use and that serves as inspiration for the curriculum and for the readings. And actually we had readings, students reading from the very first newsletters of the of SASO, and that was the main instructive material. This is us after the end of one of those sessions in one of the schools with the kids and some of the organizers here from Bantu Thoughts, for example. Now, this happens there in Soweto in the community, but we're also doing collaborations. You know, this practice of producing, the Black knowledge and epistemic practice extends to the university. And not only to the work that I have done there, but also to work that here we're benefiting ourselves from the work of the Black House. So a couple of years ago, in 2018, we had the fortune of having Sandy Hadebe with us, presenting platform, intellectual platform of the Black House in an international conference. And then later on, Sandy and also Young and Abelwi, a Korean doctoral students, now a professor, and the Mireille Fanon Mendes France, and myself. Mireille Fanon Mendes France is the daughter of Franz Fanon. We co-edited a special issue for a journal called Bandung. And so, of course, the Bandung refers to the Bandung Conference of Afro-Asian Peoples. And this is another way of producing, knowledge. And Bandung, the spirit of Bandung, you could see it as ideology, but it's also, for us, it's also has epistemic value. And so in this journal and in the conference, we convene a group of scholars and intellectuals to help us make the case for the relevance of Bandung as an epistemic platform against assimilation into capitalism, against assimilation into anti-Black practices, and for another world. And but then I was in Pretoria, I was in South Africa, invited by the Academy of Sciences of South Africa, ASAF, and they invited me a distinguished scholar, and I went to different universities, Nelson Mandela University, WITS, UCT, University of Pretoria, making different presentations. One of them specifically, actually in all of them, I talked in one way or another of the Black House paradigm, because this was in preparation to the summer school. All of this was informing the school, that the meeting that then we have with the students. But this is something that the University of Pretoria share with the community, right? So I was at the University of Pretoria presenting the Black House paradigm as a platform for decolonizing knowledge at the university. But part of this is inspired in the work that we did in the community. We taking the SASO newsletters to Black youth in Soweto, and from there engaging in multiple dialogues, and that was one of the results of the dialogue. So I wanted to present this again, and this is, it's not simply African, is Caribbean, is both, and it's also Black, generally speaking. And I end with this. For us, the category of Blackness touches on Blackness, of course, but also on the experience of being colonized. And so there is a linkage with colonized peoples. And also there is a linkage with indigeneity, right? Being indigenous and facing genocide and colonization. So these are different issues that we connect with the notion of Blackness. So when we talked about a Black House paradigm of knowledge production, is a paradigm that allows us to, is the decolonial, is affirms the lives of indigenous peoples and Black peoples and the knowledges and symbols and artistic practices and so on. So I will leave it there, and I hope that that gives you kind of a sense of what we have been doing. And again, I invite my colleagues from the Black House, among others, to also enter the conversation as well. Thank you.
Okay, now thank you very much for giving us that intro and laying the carpet for us, as it were. Whilst you were presenting, we were fortunate to welcome also Comrade Mandla. He joined us just about 5 minutes after you had interrupted talking, so he's here in our midst. Welcome, Comrade Mandla. Can you just greet the audience and the participants to believe me when I say that you are present here?
I am present, and I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes, no, we can hear you. We can hear you, Tawa. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Comrade Nomagugu, are you there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay. Are you in a position where you can contribute now? Are you settled? Because I want to bring you in next.
No, unfortunately not. Yes.
You are not settled yet.
Yes.
Okay. Let me then bring in Comrade Mandla Seleoane, and we will wait for you to settle, and then you will be the next speaker after he has shared with us what he has prepared. My tower, it is your platform. We did the introductions when you were not here yet, but let me just recap a bit that Comrade Mandla comes from our ideological bloc, the Black Consciousness Movement. He is truly one of the ideologues under whom we cut our teeth, wrote as many pieces and in the old Azanian Labor Journal, which we used as our political education material back in the 80s and 90s, which we find most valuable today to remind ourselves of where the struggle was and where we ought to be going with it as Azapo in the Black Consciousness Movement. But Comrade Mandla is also an author. He has written many books. Amongst those, let me just see, I had taken them out. Oh yes, I see one here. Pardon me for that. Okay, one of his books is Without Fear or Favor, Political Essays by Mandla Seleoane. So enjoin you to get a copy of that book. And he's also written Reflections on the Freedom Charter, 1955, which he wrote jointly with Ndade Ben Mokoena. I think he has written other books, but you know, he's regularly invited to share his political ideas by many institutions, and you know, we are really feeling embellished tonight that he has been able to make time despite his intense schedule to come in and share what he has prepared on this topic. My tower, let me give you the platform and then you can interact with the audience after. Thank you very much, Tao.
Thank you very much, Comrade Moemedi. I hope I am audible.
You are, but if you can just get a bit closer to the mic so that it can project much more properly. But go ahead. If we struggle, we'll let you know.
I will just increase the volume and see if it makes a difference.
Okay.
But thank you very much for the invitation. I feel truly honored to have been invited to share some ideas on what I think is a rather important topic at this point in time in our country. Now, there is, on the one hand, the topic proposed, which is a history of Black ideology and practice. And then there is, on the other hand, some guidelines which have been suggested to the presenters in terms of how to approach the topic. When I looked at the two, I wasn't quite certain that they sit comfortably with each other, and I will say why. Now, the organizers of this seminar subtly caution that we should not put on a Western lens in discussing the topic.
Okay. Yes.
The huge challenge I found myself facing was, am I allowed, for instance, to debate the tension between the topic and the guidelines provided for discussing the topic? If I debate that tension, do I risk being accused of Eurocentrism? Now, here's how I resolved the problem for myself. I simply assumed that the organizers of the seminar would like us to have an authentic conversation, and that I would be inauthentic both to myself and to you if I pretended not to see the tension between the guidelines and the topic. But now, what is the tension that I'm speaking about? The history of the term ideology goes back to 1795. It was coined by one French philosopher called Destutt de Tracy. When he coined the term, he had in mind a science of ideas aimed at improving and clarifying the public mind. However, in time, the term has acquired different meanings and applications. We sometimes, for instance, see ideology as a kind of blueprint or doctrine, political doctrine, according to which society should be ordered. Now, in the Marxist tradition, there's a tendency to see ideology as a set of ideas or values whose social function is to consolidate or preserve a particular state of affairs, usually an economic order. Now, it has to be clear, therefore, that neither of these two understandings or applications of the term ideology conveys or even intend to convey knowledge. Clearly, ideology in these latter senses is meant more for the purpose either of mobilizing people around a particular political goal or for justifying a certain state of affairs. When, therefore, one of the guidelines for the discussion mentions ideology and knowledge side by side, when one of the guidelines requires us to explore the possibility of mainstreaming Black ideology in academia, I suggest that there's a tension in what we are expected to do. But what does that mean? For me, at least, it means that we should make a special effort to understand the role of ideology in society. It means we should make a special effort to understand the role of ideology in the things we do. I insist on the distinction because over and above what has been said in introducing me, I am also a logic student. And I want to insist that to draw these distinctions is not to be Eurocentric. It is essential for the way in which we conduct ourselves. My disposition is that talking about ideology side by side with knowledge or academia might easily lead us to what Gilbert Ryle called a category mistake. I won't get into the details about what that means. If we fail to draw the distinction between knowledge and ideology, we might demand, for instance, with disastrous consequences, that people should relate to ideology in the same way that they relate to knowledge. I do not mean with this argument that knowledge or academia is free of ideology. Unfortunately, knowledge construction takes place in a space which is already fraught with ideological considerations. I think it was Ngugi wa Thiong'o who once observed, and I quote, that anthropology was conceived in sin, end quote. Now, the knowledge that was constructed under the rubric of anthropology was never politically or ideologically neutral. I make the argument I make because it is necessary to guard against ideology getting presented to us as knowledge. Let us complete the statement by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He said, although anthropology was conceived in sin, it has had some unintended consequences, end quote. Whereas when colonialists introduced anthropology, the intention was so that they might be better able to control the native, anthropological studies have yielded stuff which is quite antithetical to the desired control. Stuff, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o puts it, which was quite unintended. The unintended stuff was possible only because some anthropologists, and amongst them our own Makosezwe, Bernard Makubane, looked beyond the ideological considerations which framed anthropology. Now let's talk about ideology. I take my cue from Sam Noluchungu, who wrote as follows: the character of the state conditions not only the terms of domination and submission, but also the ideologies and political behavior that challenge and reject it, end quote. There are at least two consequences which must flow out of this for anyone who accepts the proposition argued by Noluchungu. The first is that ideologies are not developed in a vacuum. For an oppressed people, they are conditioned by and are appropriate to the problem one seeks to address. If we look back to the introductory remarks made about the evolution of the term ideology, we have to say that for the ruling group, ideology is conditioned by and appropriate to the social order they wish to establish or preserve. The second consequence is that no ideology is or can be permanent. When the conditions which threw up the ideology no longer exist, there can be no objective basis for holding on to an ideology which helps preserve nothing, or an ideology which responds to a state of affairs which does not exist anymore. And then I want to talk a little bit about national liberation ideologies. In this segment of the discussion, I wish to address the issue around the origins and evolution of what is referred to in the guidelines as quote-unquote black ideologies. I have already referred to Noluchungu, where he argues that the character of the state conditions the ideologies which oppose and reject that state. That part of the argument suggests, in effect, that resistance ideologies are thrown up and shaped by the terms of domination. If the problem throwing up the resistance is foreign domination, the response to that is going to take on the form and shape of nationalism. But Noluchungu takes the view that this initial response to the problem is not impermeable to other political considerations. He writes, for instance, I quote, "The colonial state, because of the role it gives to national and racial domination and oppression, calls forth in opposition to itself and to the economy it would defend, alignments among the subject population that are focused primarily on the terms of political domination rather than those of class exploitation. In time, however, such movements may acquire a more definite economic character. While national movements are to be distinguished from class movements, they may and often do provide the medium in which class struggles can develop and can, in their own right, severely weaken the ideological and political support of the order of class exploitation," end quote. Now, after analyzing the twin problems of colonialism and imperialism, Kwame Nkrumah pointed out that Africa's liberation objectives are defined by what he called, quote, "the three political components," end quote, namely nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and socialism. Now, he then writes as follows after identifying these three pillars. He says, quote, "The three objectives of our struggle stem from our position in revolt against exploitation in Africa. These objectives are closely interrelated and one cannot be achieved fully without the other. If one of the three components is missing, no territory on our continent can secure genuine freedom or maintain a stable government," end quote. Now, it bears pointing out that Kwame Nkrumah wrote this in 1968, One therefore sees the ideological shifts which were taking place at the time already in the circles of the liberation movement in Africa. Before Ghana got its independence in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah had written, quote, "Seek ye first..."
I mean, really though.
Okay, please, participants, make sure that your mics are on mute and that we don't disrupt the speaker whilst they are on the podium. Let's manage our households, the background, and know that we are in a seminar. Please, Comrade Mandla, go ahead. What happened now? Wait. Hold on. I might have muted him as I was trying to mute somebody that was disrupting us. That's the problem. Okay, all right. I'm sorry, my tower. Please unmute.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I was trying to mute somebody that was disrupting your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
I was saying then that before Ghana got its independence in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah had written, quote unquote, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all other things shall be added unto you," end quote. Now we bear testimony that the political kingdom does not quite add all things unto us. Now Nkrumah saw that and revisited the question. Now, Mamadou Dia saw the problem 7 years before Kwame Nkrumah saw it, and he wrote as follows, quote, "Since the colonial power imposed domination of foreign capital everywhere, there is naturally in the mind of the proletarian nations complete identification between capitalism and nationalism, between the political system and the economic system. Thus, it is understandable that in rejecting colonialism, the most conscious leaders of the organized countries also reject at the same time the capitalist system," end quote. What we see, therefore, is that liberation struggles tend to start with nationalism as the driving force. At some point, however, they come to the realization that there are questions which cannot be answered purely on the basis of nationalism. At times, this realization is brought about by the organic development of the struggle itself. At other times, the realization comes about after the struggle has supposedly achieved its objective, but finds itself at a cul-de-sac in relation to things the erstwhile liberation movement thought it would be able to do after the proclamation of independence, excuse me. But of course, there are cases where the erstwhile liberation movement never comes to this realization. Cases where the erstwhile liberation movement never really contemplated anything else beyond the proclamation of independence. Cases, as Frantz Fanon writes, where the native never ceased to dream about putting himself in the place of the settler. For some nationalist leaders, taking the place of the boss was always what the liberation struggle was ever about. Now, let me conclude. I have deliberately sidestepped one of the discussion items in which it was indicated by the organizers that we should look at Black ideologues, their ideas and theories and their influence. Realizing that I have only 15 minutes for the presentation, I thought I would like to devote the remaining few minutes of the time allocated to me to discussing a different matter, rather than names of people and views which should be fairly well known among political activists. Look at Black ideologues, their ideas, theories, and their influence. Realizing that I have only 15 minutes for Am I safe to proceed?
Yes, yes, Tower, you can proceed, yeah.
Thanks. There are, in my view, two needling questions which we need to ask about our current political situation. The first is whether 1994 has closed the chapter we might meaningfully speak up, in which we might meaningfully speak about nationalism in South Africa. The second is whether, given the collapse of the Soviet Union, it makes sense to continue speaking about socialism. Now, let me deal with the nationalism question first. Both Nkrumah and Fanon's writings suggest that after the colonial flag had been lowered in the colonial countries, a different type of colonialism kicks in. Fanon writes with reference to the Algerian Revolution that not much changed after the lowering of the French flag. He says one often heard murmurs among Algerians to the effect that, quote, it was not worthwhile then our becoming independent. In other words, when common Algerians looked at what was happening in their country, they started wondering whether the liberation was worth anything. There are many people I hear in South Africa, even people who were involved in the liberation struggle, ask whether it was all worthwhile. The basis for this question, the basis for the Algerian murmur, is that nothing much has changed for ordinary people. The colonized country has raised a new flag, but the people's conditions of life have changed very little. At places, they have in fact deteriorated. A study conducted under the auspices of the University of Natal in 2008 indicated that the correlation between poverty and race, between poverty and sex, was in fact much higher in 2008 than it was in 1994, which tells you just how much change we have had in South Africa. Under these conditions, it is tempting to think that there was perhaps something wrong with the liberation struggle. I think we should resist that temptation. It might also be tempting to suspect that perhaps nationalism was a wrong vehicle for prosecuting the national liberation struggle. I want to suggest that to the extent that the new rulers of the previously colonized country are running it, as Fanon points out, in the interests of the former colonial power, there is still in the nominally independent country a national question. The new nation does not exist for itself, and to that extent, nationalism might retain an element of currency. What about socialism? The writings by Nkrumah and Mamadou Dia, which postulated socialism as an inherent part of the national liberation struggle, were produced in the 1960s. In 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed. The collapse threw up the question whether socialism can ever be made workable. I think the first thing we ought to do is assert that capitalism is unworkable. Fortunately, more and more social analysts are coming around to that view. Therefore, capitalism can no longer be presented as the ultimate form of social organization. Secondly, I like to point out that we should, if the debate is to be conducted honestly, consider all the historical evidence if we wish to draw comparisons. The first capitalist revolution occurred in 1143. It was crushed. Capitalism, as we know it today, finally established itself in the 15th century. In other words, it took more than 300 years after the initial setback of capitalism to re-establish itself. The Russian Revolution occurred in 1917 and made the socialist experiment possible. The Soviet Union, which was paraded rightly or wrongly as a model for socialism, collapsed in 1989. The Soviet Union itself had a lifespan shorter than 72 years. Now we have to ask ourselves where the intellectual honesty is in comparing more than 300 years with less than 72 years. However, here is the historical reality. society has passed from various forms of economic organization in order to get to capitalism. All the previous forms of economic organizations got supplanted by those in competition with them. There is, therefore, I want to argue, no historical basis for supposing that capitalism will exist forever. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Comrade Mandla. Yeah, I think this has been a whirlwind of a presentation. And I quite like, you know, the way you have started with the tensions on the topic itself and the guidelines that we had given, because naturally a discussion on ideology presents tensions and those contestations. But you know, in your presentation, when you quoted Noluchungu, I don't know if it was my reading of the quote. It seems to suggest that he says, you know, people often start from a nationalist perspective in their struggle, that is, and ultimately gravitate towards a class struggle. Now, if my reading of that quote is correct, does it then suggest that, you know, nationalism at some point becomes redundant? Or do people continue to struggle and to remain nationalist in their perspective? And is that then a legitimate ideology or a legitimate struggle to pursue? I just thought perhaps, you know, I should ask for expansion on that point. And of course, you know, historically, there's always been this debate between a national struggle or national liberation struggle and the class struggle. Oftentimes, those who base themselves on a national liberation struggle, I'm trying to avoid calling it a nationalist struggle because of the South African connotations. So I'll stick to national liberation struggle. They have also expanded the charge of economic reductionism to those who believe that the ultimate struggle, and perhaps the only struggle, then becomes a class struggle. So I just want to pick your brain on those 2 points, perhaps to expand on your very elucidating presentation on ideology, on knowledge, and all the subjects you have touched on.
Okay, thanks for those questions, Comrade Moemedi. With reference to the first question, which, as I have understood it, is does nationalism at some point then become redundant? Now, if one accepts Noluchungu's premise that an ideology arises as a response to something, if one accepts Noluchungu's argument that nationalism arises as a response to foreign domination.
Yeah.
Now, my response would be something like this. Assuming that the national struggle got prosecuted successfully, and there was no longer any foreign domination in the country where the struggle was prosecuted, then of course it would not make sense to retain nationalism because what it sought to resolve has been resolved. The difficulty we have, the practical difficulty we have, and Fanon points out this difficulty, Nkrumah also points out this difficulty, Dia also points out this difficulty, that when the colonial master leaves, he doesn't leave lock, stock, and barrel. He first makes sure that he retains control in the previously colonized country. Now, to the extent, as I have tried to indicate, that the previous colony continues under the new leadership, under the new rulership, to be managed in the interests of the colonial country, there is a basis for retaining an element of nationalism, so long as we know what we are doing with it, so long as we don't retain nationalism for its own sake, we are retaining it as a vehicle in order to achieve something, then there shouldn't be any problem about that.
Okay.
Your second question is about the whole issue of reductionism. Now, I think, incidentally, that question can be asked both ways. In the same way that nationalists often say those who argue for the class struggle are reductionist in that they reduce everything to class, it can also be said that the nationalists are reductionist to the extent that they reduce everything to the national question. But I don't think that those arguments are very helpful. In Azapo, we dealt with that question, and I think the way we resolved it was that we said the two-state theory of revolution is unworkable. It has not worked anywhere in the world because once the nationalists settle into power, they lose the interest to pursue the second phase of the revolution. And so we have always been clear in Azapo that the national question and the class question must be fused so that the struggle for national liberation is at the same time the struggle to end class exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I must say, well answered. I really quite enjoyed your exposition on the two questions. Professor Maldonado Torres, perhaps a rejoinder question to you as well. Thank you very much for the presentation you made earlier. What I wanted to check, perhaps you can build on this, is we have a number of Caribbean, Latin American scholars. You will explain to us where the issue of the mestizos frames this question of ideology. But we know that Frantz Fanon comes from the island of, is it Martinique or Saint Martinique? Maurice Bishop, Walter Rodney, many of these writers, thinkers that we hold up as our ideologues on economic and political questions actually come from the Caribbean, if I may use that. But beyond those, then you have Kwame Nkrumah, not Kwame Nkrumah, I mean Ernesto Che Guevara, and you have Fidel Castro, and some of those Latin American revolutionaries that we may not know. Wouldn't you say, or how would you explain the overlaps in their thinking as people who struggled against colonialism in their area of the world, but who also had a connection with the African struggle and the black struggle, as you had defined it, as people who come from a formerly colonial condition, people who suffered slavery, and I don't know what the third category was. What is the interaction? How would you understand their ideas as ideology? And we are using ideology very loosely here as a system of ideas, but perhaps drawing from Marx, not just a system of ideas, but a system of ideas that is instrumental towards changing the world, because that's how we as political activists understand ideology, that it's a system of ideas directed at changing social reality, not just, ideas in the abstract. But let me not expand a lot. I hope you got the gist of my question and that you'll be able to distill it for us. Thank you. You may come in, Professor.
Yes, I think that there is one topic that is not the main part of your question, but I want, it is connected partly with the previous presentation too, and with what I said before, is examining the relationship between ideology and knowledge. And let's say we talk about Black ideology and then Black knowledge. What are the similarities? What are the differences? Of course, when you say ideology, typically with ideology, you say, well, it is something that is politically biased in a particular way, whereas knowledge is supposed to be neutral and kind of disconnected from. We know that that's not the case.
Yeah.
That it is, I mean, that what is called ideology has epistemic value and elements with epistemic value, and what is called knowledge is embedded in also in a system of ideas in dominant ideologies. And one says Black knowledge is an effort to reclaim the idea of knowledge, and knowledge doesn't have to be neutral, and something that contributes to the struggle for emancipation and liberation does not have to be qualified immediately as an ideology. Right? It could be, knowledge could be about the different parts, components that together.
Sorry. Where are you now?
Oh, sorry. You were not listening to me, right?
Oh, no, I thought we lost you for a moment. I thought actually I had muted you when I was trying to mute somebody, but go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, I was pointing to the value of also thinking about black knowledge practices that can inform even the critique of Black ideologies.
Okay.
And also the further development and refining of Black ideologies. But there is a lot that we do at the level of knowledge. Knowledge not in the liberal form, supposedly neutral, tolerant, and so on, which we know is not neutral, but Black forms of knowledge oriented by the idea that not only Black lives matters, but anti-Blackness must cease to exist, and the world needs to be transformed. Believing that is, I think, a requirement for producing proper knowledge. That leads you to just to ideology. Anyway, I think that there is something important about this aspect that we still need to flesh out. The different, for example, when we were, teaching in the summer camp, preparing these lessons on decoloniality and Black consciousness, we're thinking to teach this is knowledge. It's knowledge to transform the world.
Yeah.
At what point this knowledge may or not become ideology, that is subject to debate. But it is important to recognize the epistemic value that is aiming to provide some, ideas that reflect some truth about the world, that truth that it needs to be transformed, the truth that colonialism, it has been linked with genocide and is killing and is oppressing. Those we take as truths, and this is taken as knowledge. Now, coming to the Caribbean, to your question about the Caribbean, the Caribbean, you were commenting the fact that there are a number of Afro-Caribbean intellectuals, some of whom have, are properly recognized as valuable contributors to African debates and to ideas in Africa. And there are others that are not Afro-Caribbean, are just mestizos, light skin, more, they appear to be white. Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and the like, who come from this radical tradition. And I would suggest that the following, that the Caribbean is the region of the globe that was, as in total was more impacted by the very wave of Western colonization and expansion through the Atlantic with the Spanish and Portuguese empires that initiated the so-called discovery. And since then, it had been affected by the English, the French, the Dutch, you name it. Like, all these empires have gone through that area, divided the area. But since the very start, right, the whole area has been defined in a strong way by this force of colonialism and by the plantation system impacted the entire area. That means then that number of centuries later, if you're in the Caribbean and you are a radical thinker, you have to contest in one way or another with colonialism, because colonialism gave birth to the region. So even if you are mestizo or white, you may be actually producing kind of knowledge that is criticizing and contributing to the critique of colonialism and so on. It may not be, however, it may not be capturing all the dimensions of the problem. It may not be capturing the extent to which racism is a problem, the extent to which anti-blackness is a problem, but it's nonetheless touching on other aspects and other areas that are important, right? And again, this is not by chance, because the region has been for a long time defined by colonialism as dependent from multiple empires in the region. And then in the 20th century, when you found Che Guevara and Fidel Castro emerge, we are also, the Caribbean is also in a way, also exposed to the last form of colonialism, or to the most recent, through the US. US being so close. The United States being so close to the Caribbean makes also the question, colonialism and extractivism and this interference from a country to another, even the most vulgar kind of colonialism of intervention of one territory to another, that still exists in the Caribbean very strongly. And think about the embargo on Cuba, think about the embargo in Venezuela of US-led embargo, and think about Puerto Rico, where I come from, which is a territory, basically a colony of the US still. So again, when you look 500 years ago or more, the Caribbean was being kind of created as a geopolitical region in the so-called modern Western, system of nation states, as a colony, as a dependent territory, a place for plantations and for producing sugar for the world market. Right? That's why then later the Haitian Revolution was so strong. And the Haitian Revolution in the Caribbean also is one of the major political kind of moments in the region that inspired generations and generations of leaders later on. So you find then colonialism and the plantation system from early on, and then you find, even even up to today, vulgar forms of colonialism and intervention in the region, making it impossible to develop, even to have the fantasy, kind of a independence and nation. There is still a struggle for the very basic means of all this. So again, when you are a kind of radical thinker, you will be very likely touching not only capitalism, like you will not be talking simply about the worker, generally speaking, but also about the long-lasting effects of colonialism. And what Afro-Caribbean intellectuals add is that neither capitalism or colonialism can be understood without systemic racism and anti-blackness. That's fundamental, and that's where this generation comes in and connect with people of color in other countries and Africa.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And we particularly express appreciation for you coming in on this seminar, because as adherents of Black consciousness, we perceive ourselves as internationalists. And we know that our Black consciousness can not only be defined to Azania, although it finds primary expression here. We've always been conscious that our Black consciousness must link up with the diaspora. And oftentimes it only becomes the Anglophone diaspora. But through our studies and our interactions, we've always heard that the biggest Black consciousness movement exists in Brazil. But because of these language constrictions, we often do not get an opportunity to understand the articulation of that Black consciousness and its activism. But we hope that with the link we have created with you here tonight, we will be able to have a look into that world. Let me at this point, I don't know if Comrade Nomagugu is settled now, because I really want her to give us her presentation. Comrade Nomagugu, are you there?
Hello, Papa. I'm here.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that you've been able to settle yourself. I must just say you are a young activist, you are a woman, And all this that we are talking about today is important for, people of your age group and your gender. And it would be a travesty if we were to have a conversation like that without having the voice of the youth and the voice of women. So please feel free to, we've already introduced you as an activist linked to the Black House Collective. So take this opportunity to share your thinking, your ideas, and what you have prepared for us. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. One question before I begin. Should my video be live or can I present just as
we would prefer if you can be live, but it's really up to you. What we would prefer if you can be live so that the audience can see you and we can interact with you like we've done with the two other presenters. But you make the call. You make the call.
Okay. Given where I am right now, I'd love to continue this way if it's okay with you.
That's fine. It's fine. We can work with that. Thank you.
Okay. Greetings, comrades. My name is Nomagugu Hloma, and I am representing Black House Collective. I'm a child of Black House Collective, and I also founded Ebukosini. Sorry, I apologize. I founded Conversations with Africa. It's been a rough afternoon.
All right.
Thank you for the invitation. I am honored as a young person to be part of this conversation with the likes of Professor Torres and the elder who just presented right now. I am representing a generation of Papa Seleoane, yes. I'm representing a generation of so-called born frees, but that's not entirely true. So I guess, yes, my voice is quite important for this conversation. Part of the discussion, or when I was invited to this discussion, I realized that it was in memory of Papa Nkgopotse. And I think it's not, I wouldn't really be able to comfortably begin my conversation without, or my discussion without honoring him. Nkgopotse contributed immensely towards the Black consciousness movement and the practical implementation of Black consciousness philosophy on the ground. A brief background to who he was. He was an anti-apartheid activist, an active member of the South African Student Organization, influenced ideological developments of the Black consciousness movement amongst students both at university level and at high school level, was a student of the University of the North, now known as University of Limpopo. And after he was expelled, went to Soweto to teach at Morris Isaacson. And he also was Tsietsi Mashinini's history teacher at the time. Why am I mentioning the significance of this? Because we are talking about Black ideological thought and the practical influence of this ideological thought at ground level. And as we are aware, after Nkgopotse was stationed in Soweto, and after he influenced young people immensely in Soweto, we had the results that was the 1976 student uprising. As a young person, I feel that the Black consciousness movement is not properly honored for organizing and for influencing young people at the time before and after the 1976 uprising. And given the 1994 history that we are often provided with, we are given lies as history. So every time we get an opportunity to honor people like Nkgopotse's contributions towards development of liberation theory, of Black liberation theory. Black ideology and its significance. Ideology would be, I think the other speakers have explained ideology at a much deeper level. I don't really need to touch on this longer, but it's a set of ideas that influence economic and political policy. So every society is founded on a certain type of ideology. And it's very significant to be able to examine that ideology and examine how it impacts on human life. Black ideology still refers to a set of ideas, but that are founded on an African worldview and are aimed at influencing political policies in pursuit of liberation and self-sustenance. So we can talk about ideology, but because of the knowledge systems that we have, and I think the other speakers have spoken about this, because of the general knowledge systems that we have, when you talk about ideology, sometimes people assume that we're talking about European ideology, or it's because European culture and knowledge systems have dominated global discourse. And generally, when you say ideology, we think or we assume that you're talking about European ideology. So this is why it's important for us to specifically mention Black ideology, an ideology that is set on African principles or in African worldview. Black ideology allows us to define meaning in an Afrocentric lens. The primary mission is the liberation of all Black people and of all oppressed peoples of the world. These ideologies can be traced back to struggles against slavery, but can also be traced back to people like Webb Du Bois and their work, men like Marcus Garvey, and later on people like Frantz Fanon, Malcolm X, Robert Sobukwe, Steve Biko. And in the post-apartheid South Africa, because I'm going to limit my discussion to South Africa, it can be traced to movements such as the Blackwash movement of Azania, the current Black House Collective, and maybe an example for the United States would be the Black Lives Matter movement. Our foundation is Biko's Black Consciousness. We honor the contributions of the Black Power movement of the 20th century in the USA and the contributions of Frantz Fanon in the development of our modern day Black liberation theory and what we know as Steve Biko's Black Consciousness in South Africa. Steve Biko developed an ideology that aimed at bringing the Black person back to life and at giving the world a more human face. So in Biko's analysis, the world as it is today was not human, or the structure of global power and global politics was not human enough. And through the implementation of Black consciousness and of bringing Black people back to themselves so that they can be able to participate in the global political sphere as human beings and as men and women in the rightful sense of self, the world could achieve a more human face. The primary aim was to achieve mental liberation for Black people. And the secondary aim was to unite Black people for the cause of liberation. Of course, most people that are listening to this are familiar with Steve Biko, but we also know that he emphasized on much more on unity amongst liberation movements and amongst Black people. For Biko, complete liberation could not be achieved if we are not united in our cause for freedom. In 1972, the South African Student Organization established the Black People's Convention, and the aim the aim of this conversation was that it was a political organization that was tasked with promoting the Black consciousness ideology in the country. So it was two missions, as I have explained, bringing the Black man back to himself and at the same time uniting Black people for the cause of liberation. At the same time, when you talk about Black liberation theory or Black ideology in South Africa, we cannot not talk about Pan-Africanism, or Black consciousness cannot function without Pan-Africanism. So a proper Black liberation theory in South Africa current day would be a Black conscious Pan-Africanism. We talk about Robert Mangaliso's Pan-Africanism in South Africa, emphasizes on the unity of both these movements and ideological thoughts. Black radical thought, I've mentioned this, has been founded on both ideologies. One cannot exist without the other. Pan-Africanism is primarily defined as an act of being pro-African, and it's also a global movement that aims at achieving solidarity amongst all African people. This movement can also be traced back to anti-slavery and resistance to colonization of African people. Primary belief of Pan-Africanism is that unity is vital. African people in the diaspora and African people at home work together when they are fully conscious of who they are, work together towards their own liberation. Can be traced to people like Henry Sylvester Williams, to Papa Marcus Garvey, and so forth. Okay, I have mentioned before that Black consciousness philosophy and Pan-Africanism philosophy, when both these ideologies have been united and implemented at the ground, part of the examples of practical results that can take place is the 1976 student uprising, post-1994 youth movements that have been influenced by this, as I've mentioned, the Black Watch movement of Azania and many, many other organizations, but also the current Black House Collective. I would love to touch on the work that is done by the Black House Collective, including the literacy or the school, the Saturday school that is done by the collective in order to infiltrate and influence the minds of young people and conscientize young children and to plant the seed of consciousness from a young age in young children. But the work of Black House Collective and Black Watch movement, which I feel is a very understudied movement, because the contribution of Black Watch movement towards conscientization of so-called born frees is quite significant, but most of the time we do not study this movement, or we do not study its lifespan and its influence on the post-apartheid or post-1994 radicalization of young people. But basically, when you bring Steve Biko and when you bring Robert Sobukwe to young people and you introduce ideologies that apply an Africanist worldview, you are bringing life back to young people, and you're bringing the Black men basically back to themselves. And that way we'll be able to achieve self-realization. Black radical thought within academic spheres includes the introduction of Black consciousness philosophy in undergraduate programs and in further exploration on Black radical thought in postgraduate research. But mainstreaming Black ideology in the academia, I want to emphasize on a new study by Professor Nyasha Mboti called Apartheid Studies. Dr. Mboti is trying to establish this field of studies because he feels that there lacks a framework, an Afrocentric framework that studies phenomena or that studies or that investigates the crime scene of apartheid. So Professor Mboti developed a framework and it's called the Apartheid Studies that seeks to study apartheid, to unveil it, to study it as a school of thought in itself. He aims at critically analyzing the evolution of apartheid before 1994 and after 1994. So according to Professor Mboti, apartheid did not end in 1994, which is the same thing that the Black Watch movement has been teaching throughout the early years of the post-apartheid dispensation. But Dr. Mboti criticizes scholars and young people or young scholars in the post-apartheid dispensation because we keep studying the apartheid crime scene. If we do, we keep studying the apartheid crime scene using Eurocentric lens or using a framework that has been developed by European people. So Mboti argues that if we use a framework that has been developed by European people, how can we accurately study the crime scene of apartheid? So apartheid studies as a field is that framework. He uses this framework to address the world. So Mboti argues that apartheid cannot only be located in South Africa, but can be located everywhere in the world. Even goes as far as arguing that COVID-19 in itself was a form of apartheid. But also Mboti uses this framework as a form of self-evaluation, not only evaluating the systems of oppression, but also evaluating our own limitations within Black radical thought. So Mboti goes back and looks back at people like Karl Marx and Marxism and criticizes those philosophies in terms of their application in the Black world, or in trying to study or investigate the crime scene of colonization of apartheid. And he also goes back and comes back to self-evaluate the likes of our own Black consciousness philosophy and our own Pan-Africanism philosophy as espoused by Robert Sobukwe. So this is a critical approach that has been developed by Dr. Mboti in allowing us to critically study what apartheid was and what apartheid continues to be in the so-called post-apartheid dispensation. And Mboti aims at establishing a center for apartheid studies within academic institutions of South Africa. But also we can come back and argue that he's establishing this center also within the institutions developed by white people or by European people for the advancement of European thought. But it's the beginning, or it's the beginning. But this will ensure that hundreds of students can be exposed to this framework and can critically employ it for future ideologies. And part of our work with Black House Collective and with Conversations with Africa is that it's to take these ideologies, self-criticism as well, and these frameworks that have been developed by African people for African people back to the community, back to the township, and to bring them back at ground level so that we can apply them at ground level for the normal men and women, Black child on the road, or young Black people on the street, so that Black consciousness doesn't become, or Pan-Africanism as well, do not become ideologies that are discussed in academic institutions only, but can be practically implemented at ground level through literacy programs, through outreach programs, and through discussions such as this one. So I hope that my presentation has answered most of your questions about Black radical thought and about the introduction of apartheid studies. I think I will end it here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've been absolutely on point. And thanks for sharing all those names and the contributors to Black thought, because that's what we also want to hear. But I particularly like the point on which you started, because you tried to also delve into the tension that we had about ideology and knowledge, and or what Professor Maldonado calls epistemic thought or epistemology, as we often call it. That knowledge production, as we seem to be agreeing here, is not a neutral project. It is influenced by politics. It is influenced by so many other forces. And as Comrade Mandla had said, there is a nuance between ideology and knowledge. And I think we're going to open up this discussion to trace those nuances and to find overlaps, to find those disjunctures between ideology and knowledge. That's the whole purpose of what we wanted to discuss tonight. And I think all three of you as panelists have taken us through. We were not looking for a list to element on this one is a Black ideologue, that one is not a Black ideologue. We were looking for practice. We were looking for systems of ideas in various parts of the world. But you did mention, for instance, somebody has said here that the first revolution or Black revolution is the Haitian revolution, and that we must not, keep it out of our lens or our deeper recesses. You mentioned Robert Sobukwe as a good big contributor, Nyasha Mboti, and Comrade Mandla also touched on Mamadou Dia, someone that I had never known about. And the whole purpose of having this kind of seminars and discussions is to share knowledge, is to conduct an open learning program. And I think that's what we seem to have achieved. But strangely, none of us have mentioned Amilcar Cabral in tonight's discussion. But I'm not asking you to mention him. I'm just saying that, we recognize him as the one of the leading lights or the leading ideologues in the Black world and on ideology. And in particular, and this is significant, let's not forget his major contribution to the interconnectedness of struggles around the world with his speech at the Tricontinental Conference. I think the first one that was held in Cuba, and then I think the second one was held in Cairo later. It's those traditions that we want to bring back, where we engage in knowledge sharing, we analyze the world and look at the overlaps and the divergences as we prosecute the struggle, because the struggle is still very relevant today. Now we have 30 minutes with which to share this topic with all the participants. So I'm going to open up for everyone who is here who wants to comment or to ask a question, but I would want us to do it very orderly so that we can derive value out of the discussion. And let me also mention that we've been running these seminars, but seemingly there is much more interest in this one tonight because we have somebody who has tuned in from India. I can't see Nurul Hoda, welcome. We also have, as usual, our comrade who is most supportive, Comrade Nontobeko, joining in from the UK. And I saw a comrade of ours of long standing, Comrade Marjan Boelsma from the Netherlands, also tuning in. Welcome, comrades, and many others that I may not recall. If you are tuning in from other countries, other places, welcome to the seminar. So let's give over to the participants to also make their input and to interact with what has been presented this evening. All I'll ask you to do, if you can do that, is raise your hand so that I can see that you want to be in the queue. If you don't know how to do that, please just unmute and ask your question or make your comment. So this is your time and to delve into the topic. Please come in. By Jayong, as we would say in East Xhosa, or is there anyone that wants to come in, ask a question or make a comment?
It looks like Comrade KB is struggling to say something there.
Oh, Comrade KB, did I miss you?
No, I'm not struggling, Comrade Mandla.
Okay, it's just the timing. Yeah, all right. Go ahead.
No, I'm not about to say anything now.
Oh, you are not about to say anything. I don't know how Comrade Mandla, maybe it's a Pretoria thing, Okay, is there anyone else that wants to make a comment? Don't be shy, comrades. This is our platform. Let's educate one another. Let's learn from each other. I know the topic might be petrifying for some, but these are struggles we are engaged with as activists and as thinkers every day. Anyone that wants to come in? Okay, whilst you are thinking, and that's the whole point, we want you to think. Let me go back to the presenters, and if they want to have a second take or to clarify or distill some point, I'll give them an opportunity to do so, because we want to exhaust the full 2 hours and we still have about 26 minutes to go. So please keep thinking, prepare those questions and the comments.
Would you allow your panelists to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. I think go ahead, ask the question to the audience, and then and then maybe to the other panelists, they might want to take it. So go ahead, my tower.
I have been wondering for a while, you know how we have traditionally defined Black people.
Mm.
I have been wondering for a while what we think about that definition in 2021. Could I have some thoughts on that?
Okay, perhaps I'm sure it's directed to Azapo members and Black consciousness adherents here. But if I may just ask, maybe you said traditionally you're talking about the SASO BPC position on Blacks are those who are historically discriminated against by law, socially subjugated, and rally together as a group to free themselves. I think that's the original definition that you are probably referring to, and you want to know how it applies maybe in terms of relevance in today's conditions.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll hand it over to my towers who are here, and but perhaps anyone who might have come across that, so we're not restricting it to anyone. So that's a question from one of the panelists. Okay.
Let me just add that you see, part of that definition says who are by law and tradition discriminated against. That's why I'm asking that.
Yes, yes. No, I think a very relevant question for tonight's discussion. Yeah. Thank you very much, Comrade Mandla. We want it to be an interactive session, Comrade. Bring something to the party, as it were. All right. Prof, you have something to say or to add? Maybe something that you want to build or expand on? There's also the presentation by Nomagugu. Maybe let's try and distill it as well.
Hello, okay. Can I ask a question?
Mr. Vusikanyele, is that you?
Yes, I'm Vusikanyele.
Thank you very much, sir. Welcome.
Yes, I'm here from here, KZN.
Yeah.
My concern is that, you know, the presenters, and they have clearly articulated the history of Black Thought, Black struggle across the globe, in Africa in particular, made reference to Frantz Fanon, his observation in Nigeria, to a point where the formerly colonized people are asking questions whether was it worth it.
Yes.
The struggle itself. And we said probably in the country like South Africa itself or Tanzania, people are beginning to ask the same question. Now, my question is, with the benefit of history in hindsight, and 26 years into so-called democracy, liberation inverted commas, how had the thought leaders in the Black liberation movement, why have they failed to address the limitations of the past revolutions? Because Tanzania is the last country to be liberated, but you can still see and experience the same feelings and thought from the ordinary people that people in Algeria have experienced. What happened to the collective of the liberation movement in this country? Why couldn't they attend to that? Because we are there. Desperation, destitute, conditions have not improved that much. Why? We had the benefit of hindsight as South African or Azanians.
Okay, thank you. Very useful question. I'm sure the panelists have heard it. If they have a brainwave, they will deal with it. But somehow, I think Comrade Mandla also, I don't know if it was you who was reflecting on, is it Bamado Dia? I don't want to misrepresent you here. That, you know, that contradiction of nationalism and its limitations that Frantz Fanon wrote about in one of his chapters on nationalism and its pitfalls, or the pitfalls of national consciousness. I think that's the question that he seeks to address there. All right. Thank you for that question. Anyone else wants to make a comment, not just answer questions? Mema Rauta, please come in.
Yeah, I also want to ask a question. I'm looking at the Caribbean people uniting against colonialism. And here in Africa, we're also colonized. And most of the countries had to go through the struggles to free themselves, although others were handed their liberation over the platter. Why is the African Union failing to be a force that unites the African governments, and also they are also failing to take a united action against the former colonizers? Why are they failing?
Okay, thank you. A question about the relevance and instrumentality of the AU with the current deteriorating socio-political conditions in Africa? That's the question from Mema Khauta, a very relevant question. I'm sure we have bright minds here who could try and respond to it. Any other question? I'm trying to get the participants to take charge of this platform. So the presenters have shared with us what they have shared with us. So let's take charge of this platform, my dear comrades and friends. Brakebi, please come in.
Yeah, thank you, Comrade Moemedi. I'm not going to try to answer the questions as such.
Okay.
But my observation is that I think Comrade Mandla has put it correctly that in as much as we fought the national struggle, there is also the class character of that struggle that we should not overlook.
Okay.
Particularly the position that Azapo took on that issue. He also raised the issue to say, does this definition of black as provided by SAS or PPC, particularly when we say by law, and I think maybe when one says by tradition, perhaps that still holds because it says that there are elements of the nationalistic elements that we need to still adhere to, or that we can that remnants of nationalism that we still find in the current situation. I think when the other issue that in light of what Comrade Mandla mentioned, bringing in the class character of our struggle, is that that's why we have problems. If you look at our struggle, it has been mainly petty bourgeois. If you look at it, if you look at it now.
We are losing you, Comrade KB. Okay. Perhaps we got the gist of his comment or question, because it looks like he's struggling with the network. There is a question that has come through here via the chats. It says, a question to all. History has not been kind to women in terms of the key role they have played in liberation struggles, particularly by liberation movements globally. How do we address the critical omission of the role of women and women liberation theorists in liberation struggles? Fundamental a question that we cannot depart tonight's or this evening's proceedings without attempting to respond to it, either in part or in full, but a very crucial question. All right, I'm gonna go back to the panelists whilst we are still thinking about the question that Comrade Mandla has raised. I hope we will be able to do justice to it. Those are the three questions. I hope you've noted them. Comrade Nomagugu has excused herself, and these are the challenges that women activists face, because she had to travel all the way to Dobsonville to make this presentation. Now she says she had to go back home because she left the kids alone due to load shedding. So she would probably not be able to join for the remainder of the program. So she has just asked that I apologize on her behalf. All right. Okay, so we are left with Comrade Nelson Maldonado Torres and Comrade Mandla Seleoane. But if there is any participant here who feels they can take one or two of the questions or comments, please feel free to also respond to them. Let me start with Comrade Torres.
Well, I can say a few things about the couple of the questions. There are two questions that seem to me very connected. The question about the, addressing the limits of liberation movements from the past, previous liberation movements. And the question about the African Union failing, because both questions are about failures, right? Failures in face of the intractability of the situation, the difficulty, failure to either learn from the past or failure to implement now or motivate a real political movement, international in Africa, to oppose colonization and to respond to it. And I think that at least one potential line of response also speaks to both questions. Because it's that, you know, we cannot underestimate the utter grandiosity of the system of coloniality that is international, that it mapped the world. Consider that even the first world maps that began to circulate in the context of European expansion. I mean, those were designed by them. They classified people across the planet geographically. They designed the whole floor, as it were. And then they gave us concepts to look at them and to look at ourselves. So the colonization is embedded in the maps, in the institutions, not only in the military powers that came and took, possession and invaded territories, but what they left, even in the best cases, it's not only an issue of the bourgeoisie staying or the interest of the bourgeoisie staying, it's that their ideas, their concepts, even the way that we look at ourselves, all of that. I mean, the challenge is extremely, extremely great. Of course, the stories of subversion, of insurgency are also magnificent and very rich. But we are up to, if we want to secure a space, a large space, emancipated space, we have to win revolution after revolution after revolution. I mean, the amount of work that needs to be done to make that happen in a way that we can then satisfactorily, right? So I would say that this doesn't mean that, yes, certainly we need to learn from the past. But I think that as much as we learn, the struggle is going to be very complicated, it's intergenerational, and we need to attend to every level of social existence and international existence. So when I was pointing to this work, I mean, the work of the Black House Collective, for example, and these collaborations between US, Caribbean, the Black House from Soweto to the University of Pretoria, to the University here at Rutgers, to a publication, all of this is trying to create a new, I mean, it's sowing, it's planting. Remember the idea of planting at the beginning? Thinking while planting and planting while thinking. So there we have to be planting for quite a while, making connections. And I think that how we can begin to undo this is by ourselves, those people interested, those of us interested in this, really supporting each other and taking each other seriously. Because sometimes we are the first ones who are extremely critical of each other, right? And so different kind of ethos has to be to do the planting effectively and to let it grow. And when it comes to the questions about women's participation and recognition, in that planting, every area that clearly has been a failure from the documentation from previous movement has to be addressed proactively. Like if we want, there is the question of why women, there is the question of women's participation in previous liberation movements. But of course, then we need to proactively look at what they did, how they did it. They may not have, whatever they wrote, we need to read it. And whatever they did that was not written, that was part of fundamental contributions to the community, from children education to going to the streets, to taking a building, or everything has to be looked at carefully and evaluated with new lights, in due appreciation of the originality and of what the action involved. And then also we have to cultivate, and help cultivate new generations of women leaders. So we have to be very proactive about that, so that if we cannot work together, we cannot just try to engage in the revolution and take the, engage in the revolution, but then, and walk very fast, but then everyone turns out to be male and heterosexual. Yeah. Right? That cannot be. We have to walk and cultivate in another way, and we have to continue, we have to do it together in the best effort. So, and for that, we have to invest in the academy from this academicism that only has us, publishing and producing knowledge in a traditional way, so that other scholars know and other generations know, but maybe we are not doing the work of planting and of growing and of bringing new generations and of, right? So that all of this work is crucially important. And I think that that's a very practical way in which we respond to the limits and of previous generations, because all the generations will have limits also, and that we try to address the complexity of this drastic, this large, incredibly complex system that has taken everything from the economy to epistemology, to thinking, to being, to symbols, to art, to ideas, everything. And we need to decolonize that in a comprehensive way.
Okay, thank you very much for that useful comment. Comrade, what's her name now? I hope she's still here. I wanted to acknowledge her properly for her question. Sajida Sadr is the one that asked that question about, and a very fundamental one, women theorists, women ideologues. And I like the way you respond to it, Professor, by saying we must make a deliberate effort to write their story, to write about them, to write about their ideas, to write about their activism. Because most of the people we call ideologues today had not set out to write a book on a system of ideas on revolution. Robert Sobukwe, what we have about him are his speeches. And stories about how he lived and conducted himself among the people. And from that, we then start to have an idea of who Sobukwe the personality was. Steve Biko, the same. He was writing essays about everyday life of Black people and the struggles that they have. Somebody then decided, well, let's collect these writings by Steve Biko into a book called I Write What I Like. So the same thing can be done about women activists and women ideologues that we must recognize properly. I don't want us to miss that important question that was asked by Vusi Kanyile. I hope Vusi Kanyile still, sorry, he's still here, about what I would want to call late liberation. You know, there's this concept about late capitalism. Perhaps we can also talk about late liberation. He says, as Azanians, we had the benefit of hindsight about the mistakes that were committed by the early adopters, so to speak. Yet, if you look at our condition today, we seem to be going the very same route that Nigeria and probably countries in North Africa have gone through, where infrastructure collapses, where there is corruption, where we don't, development goes down, as it were. He says, why couldn't we learn from the countries that make those mistakes to improve or to avert or avoid some of those mistakes, those problems and those mistakes? But in fact, in South Africa, as it tends to be now, we seem to actually be an extreme example of even the challenges that some of those countries have. As they are recovering from those problems, we are now seeming to be, inexorably sliding into those conditions. And I'm sure Mahmoud Mamdani would say, well, I'm vindicated about South Africans' false national exceptionalism, because they're going through the same route that Tanzania and others have gone through. We have 5 minutes now. Comrade Mandla, let me invite you to respond. I know your question is still standing. I hope somebody will pluck enough courage to deal with it.
Okay, thanks, Comrade Moemedi. By way of responding to Comrade Vusi Kanyile, and it's going to be, unfortunately, an answer that might be longer than 5 minutes.
Okay, fine. We have time. So I'm just trying to respect the other participants, but those of us who would want to go on just for an extra 5-10 minutes, we can do so.
Okay. Now, I think one, in trying to unzip the issues involved in the question that Comrade Vusi Kanyile asks, one has to sort of go back and take a look at quite a number of things. Now, you, Comrade Moemedi, referred to the Azanian Labor Journal.
Yes.
You indicated, you spoke about that journal. Now I'm having in front of me volume 3, number 1, which was published in April 1990. Now, one of the chapters, one of the articles in that journal was on the Harare Declaration. Now, it is crucial to understand what the Harare Declaration did in order to bring us where we are in South Africa today, where a lot of issues which we thought the liberation movement would resolve remained unresolved. But you see, you mustn't only look at the Harare Declaration. You must also look at, there's a pamphlet, I don't know if I have it in front of me here, but yes, I do. There's a pamphlet which was released by the National Party in September. They released it on the 6th of September, 1989. And that pamphlet is called The Plan of Action of the National Party. It looks something like this, if you can see what I'm having in my hand.
Okay, yeah, it looks like a National Party pamphlet, yeah.
Now, you see what the National Party does in this pamphlet. They spell out in graphical terms what their plans are about the negotiations that were impending in South Africa. Now, one of the things they say is that they are going to negotiate for a constitution which is cast in stone in such a manner that it doesn't matter who is sitting in their nays, they will never be able to change things. Now that is what they said in 1989.
Okay.
Now go to the Harare Declaration. The Harare Declaration makes promises and apologies even before the negotiations begin. You see, the process of negotiation is a give and take process. And when I was in the labor movement, when I was a labor education officer, one of the things I used to teach trade unionists is you don't make a unilateral concession on the negotiating table. You make a concession in exchange for something of comparable value. Now, what the Harare Declaration does is the ANC effectively makes concessions even before they go to the negotiating table. So in other words, it wasn't even necessary to haggle with the Nationalist Party at the negotiation table because the ANC had already accepted that they are willing to compromise on those things. That's the one thing. Now, there is something else. Before the Harare Declaration, Kenneth Kaunda announces that insofar as South Africa is concerned, South Africa is, by all standards of international law, a sovereign, independent country, and what is happening in South Africa is not a liberation struggle, but a civil rights struggle. Now, the Harare Declaration effectively buys into that we are involved in a civil rights struggle in South Africa. Now, once it was clear that the struggle in South Africa is not a liberation struggle, but a civil rights struggle, there are consequences which were bound to flow from that sort of concession. And the sort of things that Comrade Vusi asks about would never be achieved if we went to the negotiating table on the basis that we are going to negotiate civil rights. And indeed, we got a lot of civil rights. There's no question about that. Once we were at the negotiating table, we scored a lot of civil rights. And As such, therefore, it was as it was predicted. Now, I've been searching here. Comrade Musigudu Mangena was here, but I don't see his name anymore. But you see, comrades, there's a book which was published in 2007. It was published in commemoration of the 30th anniversary of Comrade Steve's death. The title of the book is We Write What We Like. That's the title we gave to the book. Now, one of the chapters in this book is written by Thabo Mbeki. The title of his chapter is Steve Biko, 30 Years After. Now, I would suggest that comrades get the book. Let me tell you the title again. We Write What We Like. And I recommend that you should read Thabo Mbeki's chapter in this book. You see, the chapter is extremely revealing because we are all aware of the so-called black-on-black violence of the 1980s. Now, many of us thought it was an accident of history that such violence happened. But if you read the chapter by Thabo Mbeki in this book, then it becomes clear that the violence was not an accident of history. The violence was orchestrated from Lusaka. Now, you have a component of the liberation movement making a decision which effectively waters down the liberation struggle to a civil rights struggle. Now, after it has done that, it embarks on a program to liquidate internal voices which might bring back liberation issues onto the negotiating table. What would you expect? Exactly what we got. That's what you would expect. Now, incidentally, that also then touches on the other question which was asked by Comrade Mahauta, which is why the African Union is not doing what one might expect it to do. As far as the African Union was concerned, by the way, there was an OAU declaration even before the AU was formed. There was an OAU declaration which effectively said South Africans are involved in a civil rights struggle. Now, if you expect that the AU would lend support to South Africa on the premise that we are involved in a national liberation struggle, when in fact it has already effectively decided to water down our struggle to a civil rights struggle, I would like to invite you to the real world. I'll pause on that point. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. You've just reminded me of an organization, I don't know if many will remember it, which was called the Five Freedoms Forum. It was an organization constituted mainly by what you would call white liberals who were opposed to apartheid, but who also wanted, who were outside of the parliamentary system like the, what was it called, the PFP at that time, but who felt that they also wanted to make their views known about how they see the future South Africa. So their struggle was based precisely on those civil rights issues. The five freedoms which they elemented: freedom of association, freedom of speech, the right to vote, I forget others. So it is not by mistake that perhaps the ANC also, the Harare Declaration, also took that concept of civil rights or liberal rights and felt that no, that's the sum total of what our struggle was all about. And that issues about land, issues about exploitation, issues about our language and our culture were not incorporated or seen as primary drivers of our struggle. Comrades, I think we are now tapering towards the end. Is there anyone who is ready to respond to that question by Comrade Mandla? I don't want to do an injustice to him by leaving it unanswered. Anyone that's ready? Comrade Seleoane Chivase, I can see you are here, but you are sitting quietly there. I want your contribution. But if there's none, let me attempt to.
The question can be answered offline.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I know. You know, like comrades like to engage you offline and outside when the issues are hot inside the debating room. But partly, Comrade Mandla, I think in your last comment, you seem to have actually touched on why or how we should understand that definition and its continued legitimacy and relevance today. When you point out to the, what's the word, the enduring institutional framework of apartheid, the definition might say those who are by law and tradition, and Comrade KB dealt with the tradition aspect that, you know, it's a saving grace for us. But how do we understand law? We should understand law as an enabler, a law as a creator of structures. Because apartheid used the law to create a structure or a structural framework for racism. When it wrote the native, what was it? Is it the Native Land Act? But when he read laws about dispossession of black people, it obviously created a structural racism which endures up to today. The white farmers who were placed on land that was previously occupied by black people still occupy those farms. So the statute might have been removed, but the institutional framework that was created by the statute still persists, it still endures, and those structural divisions that were manifested or occasioned by apartheid still persist. If you look at the schooling system, we have a new law now that says, well, we have one national education system. But most of us who live in South Africa know that, no, we still have a bifurcated education system along class lines, along racial lines, and along socioeconomic lines. So my answer to you would be that those institutions that were created by law, by apartheid and colonialism, we mustn't forget that our problems don't start only in 1948 when the National Party comes into power, but that there was the British colonialism and the various Afrikaner republics who basically followed the same template to dispossess us. Those institutions still persist today. So I would give a nuanced understanding to law, that law is not just a statute that was removed, but it's also the effects of law 40, 50 years after they have been removed. So I would say that that definition for me is still very much politically legitimate, and that we should continue to use it. But we do recognize that the statutes have been removed, but we continue to pursue our national liberation struggle, our class struggle in the Black consciousness movement, by fusing these questions, because we believe that these issues still continue to be relevant and our cause remains just. Comrades, our esteemed panelist, Professor Comrade Maldonado Torres, what remains for me is to thank you with Comrade Mandla Seleoane for having really taken the time to prepare and share the service, what you have prepared for us. Certainly on my part, I have learned a great deal. The questions were hard, but you know, I would be lying if I say that this was not a really edifying session. And the same appreciation goes to our young comrade, Comrade Nomagugu, who also made time, despite the challenges about load shedding that she confronted, to at least honor this invitation. Thank you very much. And to all the participants who have who joined and those who might have left the discussion, and it's not a lot, we still have about 23 people tuning in here. We really appreciate your giving up time during the week, which is not easy, to listen to our panelists, and hopefully also making your contributions, the comments, and the chats as well. Let us continue to remember Nkgopotsetiro, as Comrade Nomagugu has said. Let's continue to celebrate Black History Month. On Saturday, we have our last edition of the series of webinars. We want it to be a celebratory edition. So if you can, please join in. We will acknowledge you as those who have contributed, particularly the panelists. It is going to be on Black musicology or Black music. It is going to be on Black cinema or film. It is going to be on art in general. And we have also invited some very knowledgeable and esteemed panelists also for that session. But we also want you to send out an invitation to your young artists, those who can make it a truly celebratory evening, to join us on Saturday. Akilo Leboge, Mandeti Magwande, Nangomso. Please, let's have a good night and let's join in on Saturday. Wanazania. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. And continue to enlighten us and continue the struggle where you are.
Will do. Take good care.
Thank you.